Welcome to today's webinar. It's a privilege to be with you today. We're going to be talking about skyrocketing your station's impact with Epic Donor Communications. This is our way of appreciating the radio industry. Now, the good news is we are all, most of us at Advocacy have worked in radio. It's unusual for a fundraising consultant to do so. We're excited about serving the radio industry, and today is one of our ways of appreciating the industry, showing a good amount of research today, as well as some other specifications we've learned from working with ministries from coast to coast. Today, I'd like to introduce our hosts for today's webinar. We have certainly Paula Martin. You see her there on the screen. Wave, Paula. And she is our head writer here at Advocacy. Dr. Paul Virts is also with us. He's Senior Consultant of Research here at Advocacy. Lindsay John is our Ministry Engagement Manager. You heard her a little bit earlier, encouraging you on the poll. And then, of course, yours truly, Paul Martin. I have the privilege of leading the team here at Advocacy. As today goes on, at the end of our time together, you'll see this opportunity. I hope you'll take advantage of it. We're offering free How Your Station Compares about growing revenue with donor communications. Recently, we completed our work on the listener-supported radio development outlook, and we can take your information, include it into the body of knowledge we have, and output different charts to show you areas that your firm, your radio station may be able to grow. Anyway, keep that in mind for later in the webinar. Just one other piece of about today. This is what we're covering. You saw it in your email. Why have a donor communications plan? Look at the segmentation significance, and that's a high-level view on segmentation. How to engage donors with relevant copy based upon that segmentation, and then measure to make certain it all works. That's what we're about here at Advocacy, is making certain that your ministry works at a higher level. Later on, we're going to open up time for questions. And if you would be so kind, you'll see the Zoom bar, the black Zoom bar. And if you could, click the Q&A button in there and then just type in your question. Lindsay will collect those, and then we'll talk about those later in the webinar. So with that in mind, we're going to also turn our cameras off so that your full screen will be able to see the PowerPoint deck, see the slide deck. So anyway, over the next few minutes, you'll see those go away. Our first step in looking at Epic Donor Communications is talking about why go to the trouble of putting together a donor communications plan in the first place. And to work on that, Paula is going to introduce us to someone we know as Katie. Paula?
Well, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to introduce you to Katie. Katie was just recently hired by a radio station to work on their donor communications plan. And she's very excited about doing this. She was an English major in college, so automatically that makes her a good writer, I'm sure. But here's the problem. Miss Katie, not only does she get to communicate with donors, she also gets to answer the telephone and talk to people there at the radio station. She also gets to answer all the emails that are incoming to the station. Katie also recently found out that she gets to celebrate all the birthdays there on staff. She has to make arrangements to celebrate everyone's birthday. She also gets to lead tours to show people around the station. You know, all those Girl Scout and Boy Scout groups that come in. She also gets to make the bank deposits that come in every day. Those are important too. That's not the only thing Katie gets to do. Katie just found out that she gets to organize the big event dinner that happens once a year. She has to get those silent auction items and also find sponsors for the event. She also makes the rounds to the Lions Club and the Rotary Club to speak about the station and what you've got going on. Another thing that Katie gets to do, she gets to report on what the donors give each week to the radio station and if that's an increase or a decrease from last year. She also found out that she gets to upgrade the website. That's a lot of fun. The last thing Katie gets to do is she gets to do the monthly reports for the board. So Katie's plate's a little bit full, I think. So what's Katie's big problem? She just needs to get it all done, and she has no time to strategize the volume of communications that keep donors supporting the radio station. Now, y'all may feel a little bit like Katie does. And this is the things that Katie recognizes she has to do with the donor communications alone. She has to grow the amount of giving that the current donors give, increase those gifts. She also has to acquire new donors for the radio station. Not only that, she has to win back the lapsed donors, those people who used to give to you. She has to write, plus do those other things that we listed a little earlier. And she has to choose which things to do. She has to think up ideas about how to write for the station or do those other things that she's supposed to do. And not only that, whatever she writes has to have a high ROI, because you don't want to send out mail or emails and not have any response. So this is the conflict that Katie has to deal with.
You know, Paula, thank you. I think we all know who Katie is at our radio stations. We've all hired a Katie. We've all given her so many distracting things, and they're all important. And the hard part about it is we start letting things towards our donors, since they're not there in the radio station with us, we may let it slide a little bit. So we want to go back, do a reset, and say, what is it that it takes to make a compelling donor communications program? At Advocacy, we feel there are three actors in the donor communications program. First, there's vision, the vision that we have of taking the radio station, impacting people with it. The donors, these are the people we bring along with us to support, and then a communications plan that connects donors to that vision, and frankly, sometimes that vision to the donors. You'll see this kind of works out in three easy questions. The vision is, where are we going? The donors are about who is going with us, and the donor communications plan tells us how we're going to connect the two together. So let's take a look first at the vision, and this is probably one of the hardest pieces to come up with if you're in leadership at the radio station. That's where exactly are we going together? First, we have to develop a destination. Join us, if you will, to where we're going. Now, if somebody told you and said, hey, for the next 3 days, I want to go take a road trip, come join me, that sounds creepy. That doesn't sound like something we really want to do. But if someone said, hey, I want to go to Cincinnati, and we do this, I want to do this restaurant, that restaurant, I want to go to this festival, I want to do whatever it is, you then could make a decision whether you wanted to join on the vision or not. So they had a vision for the trip that they actually asked you about. Many times at radio stations, we don't share that vision with people. We may not even have it, but we certainly want to clarify that vision. It is challenging to articulate. We need to give our donors a clear picture of where we're going and what it looks like. We also, one of the reasons why we feel a little uncomfortable about coming up with a vision, because it seems accountable, but that's also the reason why it captures the donor's heart. It's a way of communicating that allows the donor to say, I now see the opportunity you see. Let's go together, and it becomes collective accountability to be able to achieve that. Perhaps one of the greatest examples of this kind of vision was when John Kennedy went before the Congress in 1961, only a few months, he was still brand new as president, and gave his Man on the Moon speech to a joint session of Congress. And here's what he said. He said, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. So in here, you can see a couple of really key points. First off, it's time bound. He said before this decade is out. And then secondly, it was specific. It was measurable. He said, we're landing a man on the moon and we're returning him safely to the Earth. Everybody's going to know if he returns safely. So that is your measurement and it was very specific. It wasn't cloudy. It was saying, we're going to go do this together. So what does it take to communicate this? And we talked a little bit about vision. Let's talk about who we're communicating with, about our donors. And to make it easier to get to know donors, Dr. Virts is going to introduce us into some general ways to segment our donors. Dr. Virts?
Thanks so much, Paul. I think all of us recognize the importance of understanding who our donors are so that we can more effectively know what to say to them and how to communicate with them. And it's also pretty obvious to all of us that not all donors are the same. They differ in many, many ways. And for our purposes in fundraising, there are a couple of important ways that we look at donors. One would be on how frequently they give. And the other one is, one other way is on the level of giving that they have in a particular year. Now, we're going to divide our donor segment, our file, into 5 segments. And let me just run through the segments that we want to be talking about as we move throughout this presentation. The first are major donors. Donors that give like $1,000 a year or more. That's a generally accepted level of what constitutes a major donor. But below that level, we also have current monthly donors. They've pledged and fulfilled 12 monthly gifts in the past year. So they're very regular donors. Then we have people who give periodically. They give less than monthly in the last 2 years, but they've given, let's say, 2, 3, 4 gifts a year. And so they have some level of commitment to your station. The next category are lapsed donors, those people that gave to the station in the past, but they haven't given in the last couple of years. And then the fifth category are people who are really not yet donors. We might call them prospects. They were given to the station, but we know they're listening to the station and being ministered to by it. So that's sort of the way to divide up that pool of donors. But what we find as we work with donors is that each donor segment is motivated differently and expect you to touch their motivation in different ways. So one of the things that we want to be able to get a handle on is what are donors' motivations for listening to your radio station. We want to get to their heart. We want to find out, why are they passionate about giving to you, and how does that passion differ across these different groups of donors? So in order to gather some data, we asked nearly 26,000 people about their giving to Christian radio ministries of various kinds, whether it's programs or radio stations. And in order to sort of tap deeper into this whole matter of how passionate they are about your radio station, we have measured passion in one way by creating what we call the Net Promoter Score. Now, this is an interesting technique that's used very widely in the business world. And essentially what we do is we ask people, how likely would you be to tell a family member or a friend about this radio station and encourage them to listen to it? And the scale that we use in asking that question is anywhere from 0 to 100. Then, without going into great detail, what we do is we take the positives, and we don't just look at the positives, but we subtract out the negatives, the people that are negative about our a radio station or any other kind of a brand, if you will. And in that way, we create a score. Those scores will range from a -100, that means everybody hates you, all the way to a +100, everybody just loves everything that you do and the way in which you minister to them. Now, what we're going to show you in a minute here are general ratings or scores for all Christian radio sort of thrown together, programs, talk and teaching formats, music formats, etc. But what we want to do is we want to be able to show you some general data. And of course, if you'd like some more specific information, advocacy can provide that. Well, here are some, just to give you a context, here are some Net Promoter Scores from very well-known brands. We'll stay sort of on the positive side of things. Notice Google has a +11. Um, uh, Apple has a plus 47, Chick-fil-A a plus 58. So here are different brands, and you can go up to Samsung at 67, and overall in Christian radio it's 73. And of course, Starbucks and Costco usually anchor the top of any of the net promoter scores that are computed. Now what I want to do now here is to drop in for you some different segments. Again, we're trying to demonstrate to you that you need to be communicating differently with different segments of people. As you might expect, the segment that gives their radio station the lower for score is those who have never given. We'll call them donor prospects. They still give you, look at that, a score of 62. That is very, very high, very, very strong. So those people somehow just need to be pushed across the line or encouraged to go across the line to become donors. Then we have lapsed donors. Their score is 65. Then we go on a little higher up the scale, and these are current periodic donors. There is a score of 76. But look at who anchors the top, even higher than Costco and Starbucks by pretty significant margin. 86. That is the Christian music broadcasters. Those are your current monthly donors. Now, I think if we were to measure, and we don't have a measure of major donors in here, you would find them at least this high, possibly even higher. And the point we want to emphasize here is that you can see how these change by various segments. The scores change. And one of the things that we have done in the research is ask people, why did you give your station this particular rating? And we give them an open-ended question. Then we go in and search for the keywords that they use. And again, we have not displayed those here. We don't have time to go into them. But we want you to know that there are some data available there that I think would be helpful to you. So we're learning about passion for the station. And but one of the other things that we want to do is we want to move it into a discussion of donors' reasons for giving and that which triggers their gift. It's one thing to have sort of a general reason. It's another thing to say, hey, what was it that really stimulated or evoked a response? So the first thing we're going to show you are some general reasons why people give. And by the way, I want you to note that beside each reason, each of these items, there is a gold bar and there's a green bar. The gold bar stands for those who are current monthly donors. The green bar are those who have given periodically, but they don't give monthly. Now let's look at the top three of these reasons for giving. I believe in the mission and vision of the ministry, and the inner feeling that God wanted me to give. We've heard that from donors. Knowing that God tells us to support those who minister to us. Those are general reasons why people might give. And one of the things we want you to notice for those three is that the ratings are really close together. And so people are telling us it didn't really depend on their level of giving. This is really important to us. But those things are sort of in the background. It's not really something that we can as directly influence as those items that are below the line. The items that are below the line I would refer to as tactics that would help trigger a response. That's why we use the term triggers. A story about someone's life that was changed through the ministry. Notice there again, stories are powerful for both of those two groups. And so you want to be able to use those in your communication with them. But here's something that we found very interesting as we moved down the list of possible triggers. We noticed that current periodic donors respond differently to these. For example, an emergency needed the ministry. They're more likely to respond to that than the monthly donors. Now, the monthly donors still are very likely to respond, but there's just that slight edge for the periodic donors. The urgency of meeting a goal that you have set. Let's say so many calls by the end of an hour or by the end of a morning drive. There again, notice that the periodic donors are a little more likely to respond to that sort of thing. They're also more likely to respond to knowing their gift would be matched by someone else. So as you can see, we've got differing motivations here, differing things that people are responding to. The last two, an offer of a free gift from the ministry if I made a donation. We've done a lot of that sort of thing in the past, giving away CDs or downloads or books, other things. And then the last, knowing the broadcaster might publicly acknowledge my gift. There were a lot of people who said, yeah, that really helps me. To us, that's sort of low down on the scale of tactics that trigger a response. But what we wanted to show with these very general data, and again, it may differ a little bit from your format or to your station, but what we wanted to show you is it's very important to consider the segmentation of the donors as we try to understand their motivations and their passions, and what is it that really drives them or encourages them to give to your ministry.
Thank you, Paul. One of the things that you want to do once you get to know your donors, we talked about the vision, we talked about getting the donors, and now we're talking about how do we connect them. Why create a unique plan for your radio station? Well, one thing, most radio stations are not staffed to a great level, and as a result, you have a lot more things to do than you have people to do them. So a plan allows you to help coordinate people inside the radio station, volunteers, and then professional firms that may assist you in deploying your donor communications plan. So having a plan helps you coordinate people and resources. Secondly, and this is where I think Dr. Virts is really talking about getting to know your donors. Building on the messaging, looking at a total arc of messaging. For instance, when you've seen a novel that may span 7 volumes, that author had a place where they wanted the reader to go by the end of that 7th volume. There was an arc of the story. What it allows us to do is create an arc of communications that build on the knowledge base of the donor as we go along. Another area, with all the different media platforms we have today, and at radio stations it's unique because we have a sizable on-air component, we have all the social media, we have email, and we have solicitation letters, as well as telephone work, outbound telephone work. We have to schedule all those media platforms to say, what is the best way to support and embrace our donors? The other thing is, we as a station may have specific schedules for us. Let's say we have a fall and spring share-a-thon, but hey, we also have a calendar year-end appeal that we're doing right between Thanksgiving and Christmas. There also may be some other times of year that are important to us as a radio station that we need to put on the calendar for our donors to see if they're attractive to those specific donors. Dr. Virts laid out a little bit of that from our previous research. And then lastly, and one that I would challenge you to consider, is there a schedule for donor seasons? For instance, one of the radio stations we work with is located in a market where there's one certain industry that really is a substantial contributor as an industry to the radio station. And every, that particular industry pays out bonuses to their executives at the end of February. So we want to make certain that our donor seasons, that we're engaging with those people at the time that they have discretionary income and are able to make a decision on being able to support the radio station deeper. Likewise, another season that is pretty common among all donors, or especially mid-level and major donors, would be calendar year end for tax reasons. Although that changes a little bit this year, it's still going to be a bit of a motivator. Plus, people are all looking at the new year. So the donor has specific schedules that we need to contemplate in our communications and messaging program. So why is it that we actually create a unique donor plan? Well, one, the motivating part is we've got to keep our station at the forefront of our donors' mind. That is really the animating vision for this. keeping our radio station at the forefront of the donor's mind. And there's two components to that. Our motivations, we've got to remind, because donors believe they gave to you more recently than they actually gave. Not too long ago, we were asked by a radio group to work with their donors and understand the ones who are uptrending, the ones who are flat, and understand those who are downtrending, what were the differences in those three donor groups. And the thing that we discovered, all three categories of donors, everybody but the monthlies, believe they gave more frequently than they actually did. Let's say if a donor's last gift was 14 months ago, they actually believe they gave only 2 months ago. That was a very common situation. So we do need to be in front of them, and we do need to remind them of their last gift. We do need to remind them moving forward. Secondly, we want to engage that donor, and it's critical because other ministries now are working really hard to win your donors. Take a look at your mailbox. If your mailbox isn't exploding with nonprofits like mine is, I'll trade you a little bit. My recycling bin gets full based on nonprofit mail. Those people are after me, they're after your donors, and they've got great causes to support, but we want to make certain we fully engage your donor and that we are not necessarily competing, but we're actually in a place where we can show and say, make a valid decision. Here's the information you need to make a decision to support and grow the ministry that you listen to on the radio station. So that's why create a plan. Let's talk about what in general is in a donor communications plan. Here's a copy of one that we typically do for radio stations. It includes a lot of these elements that you may be able to see on the left side of the page. We're not going to go into all those elements because it does take quite a bit of time. But the first thing, like Dr. Virts said, let's know who we're talking to. And that's the segments that we're defining. The second piece that we look at is why would the donor actually respond? What are the motivations they might have? And as you saw earlier, each of the five donor segments are motivated differently. So they have a different why. As far as when, what time of year, what is the schedule, what is the cadence that we need to have in our donor communications to be able to embrace our donor and let them know that we would really like them to join us on this journey. And then there's the how, where we stipulate what media is most important in the donor communications plan. In fact, let's take a look a little bit at the why, and that is where we engage donors with relevant copy. We discovered that donors typically have one of 6 different motivators. There may be others, but these make up the majority of the reasons why donors get involved with your radio station. For those who may be fairly mature in the faith, they see that God has given them a lot to manage in their life, and they feel blessed for it. So they want to be good stewards. Some have been blessed as a station recipient of your ministry. Others are see you as a blessing in their family. Others want to make a bigger impact. Some feel prompted to give. They feel like the Holy Spirit nudged them to give. And some say, I just know it's the right thing to do. These are common things we hear in focus groups and in research that help that when donors are telling us why they gave. So the next thing is to talk a little bit about when. What seasons are important to your donor and your station? Well, the thing we've discovered is that donors welcome up to 21 off-air asks per year from each ministry. So with their mailbox exploding, we can actually safely go in front of the donor 21 times a year off-air and ask for their participation in the radio station. So where would you schedule your 21 asks? Now, we naturally would say talk with an advocacy consultant because we can give you direction. We can actually work through these and develop the donor communications plan and frankly, each message out of that. But many times you'll see calendar year end is one area, fiscal year end for you if it's different at another time. Pre-fundraiser is actually an excellent time to work with donors. Another time of year might be post fundraisers for those folks you didn't see. And actually, if you fall short for those you did, summer slump letters may be something you want to schedule. And then going into Christmas, frankly, going into the Christmas music season is really, really important to your donors, because if you run all Christmas music, you really need to let them know you're getting ready to do it and why you're getting ready to do it, instead of catching them by surprise. It can interrupt their natural giving stream if you wind up doing something they don't expect. So let's talk a little bit about the plan and timing that happens. One, the methods that we use, letters, for instance. You know, I've had the great privilege of starting, running, and selling a couple of different email marketing companies in my life before we started advocacy. And so I am pro email, but I've got to tell you, every time we run a test of letter versus email, we know that letters will generate 16 times more response than email. Now, you may say, well, email is less expensive, but see, the issue here isn't just expense. It's about revenue for your radio station. We've discovered that most radio stations may think they're poor in revenue, but the truth is they're poor in relationships with databases. And so we need to have donor contact information and then be a great steward of each donor. We know that letters are 16 times more likely to get a response than email. We did a split test a few years ago where we split the letters. The radio station had roughly an 8,000 name mailing list, and we had emails and we had letters for both, letter addresses, postal addresses. And we split that into an A/B test. And all we wanted to know is, if we sent a letter to half the database, what was the response rate? If we sent an email to half the database, what would be the response? And we discovered that letters were 16 times more effective at that time. So what do you do with email? Email, we believe, and I believe fully, that email is the single most difficult medium that you can work with in fundraising. It's an unusual thing because the subject line is more important than the body that you keep up with. The message needs to be short and have a clear call to action. That is incredibly difficult to get done. And now that email is being viewed on smartphones, it's got to be brief, extremely brief. We recommend 3 paragraphs of typically 2 to 3 sentences each. It's a very difficult medium to work with. We truly believe that for radio stations to grow and cultivate their donors, email is at best a secondary medium at this point in time. Some of our radio stations use newsletters, and they see a good response from it, but many radio stations tell us their newsletters are underperforming. And frankly, in research, we've discovered that one of the greatest challenges of newsletters is that they appear incoherent to the donor. The donor doesn't really understand, why are you telling me these things? It really doesn't impact me. And then as a result, if you put a call to action in it, you've created an enormous amount of distractions from that call to action. Also, we got one too many here. There is postal cards or greeting cards. These are beautiful for thanking donors. They stand out. They can be a very difficult environment to ask. We believe there are 3 stages of working, or 3 phases of communicating with donors: thanking, reporting, and asking. This is an ideal opportunity to thank a donor, is within a greeting card. Social media is a good acquisition medium, but you're going to pay money for it. It's not going to be just through the number of people who like your station's Facebook. Part of the reason that it's a difficult medium is, let's say, Facebook's algorithms and all the social media algorithms of what your friends actually see. That's a big enough problem. But secondly, there's an environmental problem. When someone gives on social media, there is no emotional donor feeling of a private donation. They feel like, because social media is so public, it doesn't feel private. So you'll typically wind up getting small gifts through social. There are naturally exceptions to this, but social is a very difficult medium to work with. Also, because you typically, if you're using Facebook for fundraising and using their actual host for charities, you don't get all the data that you need to be able to further cultivate that donor. So we're not as big of a fan of social as we would like to be. Web forms. We also see that this is an important part of your donor communications. Whenever you have an email, the web form is your response device. The same thing on social if you're going to link outside of Facebook's realm. It's a response device. It's got to match the look, the call to action and feel, and even dollar amounts asked on the web form. Because if you click on an email and it takes you to a page that does not look like that email, it could well tell the donor that they've incorrectly that they've actually been scammed or spammed or somehow hacked in a way to go to a radio or a website that they never would have anticipated going to. So there needs to be visual continuity between the email and the web form. And lastly, if you have a longer offer that explains something, you need to have a web landing page. And again, going from email or social to the web landing page, it must match the email look and the call to action in there. One of the things that we've discovered is as we put together ask campaigns or solicitation campaigns, they typically are going to have a minimum of 3 of these media operating at one time. And frankly, if you're using, let's say, a letter and an email together, there's normally a series of emails, and each email actually extends out and reinforces the letter that happened previously. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of how we plan out the method and the timing. We mentioned in our objectives for the call today, for our time together, we wanted to measure to make certain it works and to make it work better on donor communications. And Dr. Virts, you've been measuring these things a while. You know exactly what it takes to get some information that helps guide donor communications. And it really works when there's a feedback loop. Tell us how to measure to make it work.
Well, thanks, Paul, and appreciate your comment earlier about the importance of accountability in our work. We're accountable to God. We're accountable to our boards of directors. We're accountable to our senior leadership. And of course, we're accountable to donors. So we want to be able to tell them what is happening as a result of the ministry and how our fundraising is going. There are a lot of different measures that you can use to check on the effectiveness of your donor program. For example, you could look at return on investment. How much did it cost to drop that last direct mail letter, and then how much came back in? What was your return on investment? We can measure something such as donor acquisition. What does it really cost us to acquire a new donor? And there are a number of ways one can go about measuring that. One of the easiest things to do is to look at the number of gifts you've had in the last year and the total amount of giving, and you can see what your annual donation or average donation amount is. And there are some standards that we can use to measure yours against. But that's one of the ways you can measure your work. You can also look at your retention rate. This is a very important a statistic that needs to seriously be looked at year after year. The question is, how many people that gave to you 2 years ago also gave to you in your last completed fiscal year? Just so you know, we had one research project we did, and we estimated that about 60% of the people who gave in 1 year gave in the next year as well. That means if that's true of your numbers, you've got to go out and recruit enough people to fill that gap of 40%. And then if you want to grow, you've got to replace more than that number of people. So there's just an incredible amount of work that needs to be done, but you need to be looking at that retention rate. If you don't, boy, it can really come back to bite you. Uh, One can also look at donor lifetime value. There's a fairly complicated way of computing that, but it is still one that I think is important. We can also look at response rate. That is, of all the emails you send out, how many people actually made a gift by clicking on the giving form in your email. So response rate is one, and there's so many others. How many people have given? And this is by the way, this is related to that retention rate. And what we are finding, I'll just tell you, across not just broadcasters but other sectors of nonprofits, is we have a declining number of donors, while our donor total income is going up, which means you are relying more and more on fewer people. And let me just tell you, that is unsustainable in the long run. Well, there are a lot of other measures that we could use here, but Paula, I'd like to return to Katie for a minute. How do you think she would respond to a donor communication program like what we've laid out here?
Well, if Katie is a thinking woman, and I think she probably is, I think she'd be pretty happy knowing that she's reaching the right donors in ways that connect with the donors' hearts, their reasons to give at the right time to the right communication channels. I think Miss Katie would be doing a happy dance.
Well, I agree, Paula. I think Katie would, because she actually would know what's expected of her. She'd know how to deliver these things. She could coordinate them and make them all happen. Well, thank you. Before we wrap up, I want to just say thank you for joining us today on Skyrocket Station Impact with Epic Donor Communications. We're going to answer some questions in a few moments. So if you've got any questions that we may have started something that makes you think about it, please go ahead. You may mention in that, hit the Q&A button and type in a question that you might have available for that's on your mind right now. Just in review today, what we've discussed, we talked about why a donor communications plan, segmentation significance. We showed you a very simple way. We have clients that use up to 100 segmentations and grouping them together for different mailings, but we wanted to show you a high level with 5. Engaging donors with relevant copy, how to connect to their motivation, and then measuring to make it work. These are 4 stages of or 4 phases of Epic Donor Communications for your station. Well, what we'd like you to do, if you would, and you want to talk more about that, we'd love for you to be able to talk with advocacy, either Jeff Crabtree, who many of you know, or myself. We would enjoy chatting with you more about your radio station and how you might be able to put together a donor communications plan. In fact, for our friends in radio, we've done enough work in radio so that we can actually look at how your radio station compares with other radio stations. We have prepared a 5-page report. All you have to do is contact Jeff, and he will set up a time to ask you, I believe it's 5, 6 questions, and we'll be able to get back to you to let you know, how do you rate against the overall industry? This is an industry standard report to show how you are rating your radio station against what the radio station is doing. So, question and answer. Do we have any questions out there that we can work with?
Actually, Paul, there is a couple of questions in the chat area, I believe is where it is. First question is, what is the recommended best practice in communicating with monthly donors giving electronically, and does that differ from reminders sent to monthly check writers? I think that you could send out something electronically to those who give to you electronically, that it's a monthly thing that happens without them having to send in a check. I think sending them a thank you monthly is not a bad idea, because donors want to be appreciated.
Yeah.
Regardless, whatever the reason is for giving, they want to be appreciated. Now, so you're saying I hope I get the second part of this question right. How does this differ from reminders sent to monthly check riders? Well, your whole motivation is going to be more of a attitude of thank you and gratitude. And it's not a bad thing to remind people, oh, you've committed to give monthly and we hadn't heard from you. And sometimes, they forget. People are people and they forget, or sometimes things happen beyond their circumstances. Let's say maybe their credit card expired or was stolen or something like that. And they have to think, oh my gosh, yes, I need to go fix that and start my monthly support again. So sometimes things just fall off the wagon that way.
Very good, Paula. Then a second thing, when we take a look at these kind of reminders, I know a lot of radio stations are fearful of touching their monthly electronic donors. We actually recommend that you do, and that you actually have an upgrade campaign from time to time with these monthly donors. They're critical that we have a relationship with. We can do that by thanking, reporting, and asking. We don't want to leave them alone. We just don't want to leave them alone. Hey, Paula, a second question that's been asked. What should your donor welcome email look like?
Well, first, I would recommend that it not be an email, but that it be an actual hard piece of mail that they receive. Because number one, it's so easy for people to hit that delete key. If something's in the mail, you weigh it a little bit longer before you put it in file 13, and the likelihood of it being opened, I think, is higher. And when you talk about a welcome packet, I think that number one, gratitude, thanksgiving for what they're doing. You might tell them some of the things, some of the good stories that you have about what your radio station, what the result of your programming, of your music, stories from your listeners of some of the great things that have happened, how God has touched their lives. That's a good thing to include, because it gives them, when you give with your heart, but then your brain comes in afterward to say, hey, was that a really good decision? And so if you have something tactile that you can hold in your hand and you can read, you go, oh my gosh, this really was a good decision that I made. And I think also this is a good time that you can talk to people about being a monthly donor, maybe joining your club, and other opportunities that you have for them to get involved with your station, being on your music advisory panel or volunteering for your next share-a-thon. It's a good thing to be able to reach out that way too. You want to add to that,
exactly
Paul?
Right. That's exactly right, Paula. We're going to run short on time. We're getting a lot of good questions here today. And I'm going to go through a few of them. And Paula and Dr. Virts, I'll bring you in on some of these, but we're going to keep it short here. You never really, an anonymous wrote us, you never really mentioned how to appeal to each segment. Is that something we need to contact your company about? That is true. That is, it's rather involved. It takes a lot of research, and that is normally a portion of the donor communications plan that we deliver for our clients. We just wanted to alert you today that you really need to pay attention to those differences, and we have research that's available for purchase that will give you a little bit of direction on that, but there's a lot more to it, and we'd be happy to explain more of that. If you just contact us, we're happy to get moving on that. And talk with you more about it. Any advice for recruiting volunteers to take some of those tasks off Katie's plate? Well, I really appreciate using volunteers. As Paula just mentioned, that's really, really good to keep in mind. What are things that volunteers can do? In the donor development arena, your revenue stream is so important. I would like to suggest to you to be very careful when using using volunteers. We've seen envelopes where giving statements are cross-stuffed with letters that were supposed to go to the same person but went to someone else. We have seen situations where envelopes didn't match the contents. I would be extremely cautious about using volunteers on the donor side, except during share-a-thons to receive calls. And I know that opens up a whole different set of things on credit card training and all sorts of things. We'll save those issues for another day. But frankly, volunteers, when you get to event planning and banquets and stuff like that, that's where your volunteers can help. But in your direct mail and email program, that probably is so critical to the nature of the radio station, that's like not asking for a volunteer to tweak with your transmitter. Okay. We've got another question. Can you remind us where the statistics about the success of newsletters and emails came from? There are a number of different, we monitor a number of different research organizations, and we are pulling data constantly. Email is a good way to use things. Newsletters can be, but frankly, we've seen mixed results with newsletters. And I do mean printed newsletters. They're different than a solicitation letter, and they're different than, well, let's just leave it at that. They're different than a solicitation.
Hey, Paul, can I jump in here for just a second?
Yes, please.
Just recently, we had a station that did a share, and they sent out a newsletter, and then they sent out, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 follow-up emails. And they said, you know, it had never occurred for us to do that, to send out the letter and then send out emails. And they saw a direct increase in their share-a-thon response as a result of using both a letter and an email. And sometimes it's that the emails serve as a reminder, oh gosh, I haven't given. And you know, so they'll click while they're there online. So it's not necessarily that the emails standing alone do it, it's that they can serve as a reminder for what was said in the direct mail piece. I hope that makes sense.
Great. Hey, we also got asked, a notice that you didn't point out a phone ask. With methods and timing. Is there a reason we didn't discuss it? We're running out of time. That's the only reason. Telephone campaigns, we have discovered, work very well, especially when there has been a credit card decline. The biggest problem with phone campaigns is, first off, what do you say? We recommend scripting it. We actually write scripts for our clients who do phone campaigns. And those kind of scripts typically are on the mid-level side, as well as mid-levels are when you have a large number of major donors, you split them into different segments. And so we put that together, and we also deal with what happens when a credit card fail occurs, when an expiry date, or for some reason the credit card doesn't go through. We think that that's a telephone call. The biggest challenge we typically see with radio stations or any ministry with phone asks is those typically need to happen after business hours. And you need to schedule people who will say, come in on every Tuesday night, and you're going to make a couple of hours of calling. It is a very successful way to do it, as long as you do it in the evening, not during the day.
Paul, if I could just add
Please.
there too, what we have found is that telephones calls are particularly important and productive in reactivating lapsed donors. And I know a lot of people go, "Oh, telemarketing, I hate it." Yeah, but the question is, does it work? And we've looked across multiple ministries, and yes, reactivating lapsed donors is a great way to use when you're technique to use when you're trying to reactivate your lapsed donors.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Virts. One last thing, want to let you know that this is available for you free of charge. It gives you an idea of our station comparison on donor communications, on how we might be able to help grow your radio station, and some of the things that we could pair up and be partners with at Advocacy. I want to thank you for everybody being on the call today. This has been really a tremendous time. We look forward to another time where we may be able to break open this information again. Once again, we'd be happy to talk with you about your donor communications and just have a conversation around that, offer this free, and then see if you would like us to help you with it in the future. I really appreciate our time together. Have a great day.